When she first moved aboard her father's powerboat after her divorce, Marge couldn't get used to balancing a canvas and paints and brushes on the water without all of them sliding and tipping and falling. It happened every time she stepped from one side of the cabin to the other, or whenever the wind blew, or when someone on the channel kicked up a wake. There was a path through some trees between the upper marina and the downstream boat ramps where she could set up an easel and get to work, but the labor of trudging up the ramp with supplies was just enough of an annoyance that she fell out of the habit of painting. Eventually, she packed up her supplies and canvases and hauled the bulk of them down to her newly rented storage unit in the lower marina. After that, she ventured from one artistic craft to another, from drawing to sewing to weaving to brewing her own vegetable and fruit liqueurs. She made curtains for other boaters and bottles of fruity sipping drinks. Then she started baking bread. She bought an Italian sourdough starter at a specialty bakery in Portland. The starter had been developed in Venice, and in the 1950s came straight from that great floating city to Portland via a traveling collector of yeast and sourdough starters. The collector delivered the Venetian starter and then proceeded directly to a nearby hospital. Convinced exotic yeasts were slowly turning his brain into a dense, thickening mass of cheese, he committed himself for psychiatric evaluation. The bakery never heard from him again. Marge bought a large gimbaled iron stove for her boat, causing the hull to rest several inches lower in the water, and began baking bread to sell in the marina store and give away at birthdays and special occasions. She called them her loaves of abundance. Those who received and relished the heavy, soft, seedy bread began to call it merely the abundance, as in a little slice of abundance. Let's break abundance together, or bring any kind of sauce or fondue or salad dressing, any excuse for dipping the abundance. She took the compliments in stride, unaware of the culinary sensation growing at the marina and spreading upstream and down. Marge added to the starter and let it grow. It did grow, but it also slowly dissipated in flavor and the ability to make dough rise. She noted the decline as the weeks went by and went back to the bakery, only to find that the business had changed hands and no one remembered the starter she was looking for. When the marina started commenting on the new taste, they chalked the change up to the problem of familiarity. But Marge declared the death of the abundance and moved on to other things. Good things never last, she said matter-of-factly to those who asked her for bread. She sold the oven, had it removed from the boat to make room for other things, and was surprised by the sorrow that built up in the empty space it left behind. She dropped the clay pot containing the starter into the river, turned off the lights in her boat, and wept into her pillow for a good while that night. She used some of her abundance profits to enroll in a class at an art college in the old industrial area north of downtown Portland. With renewed purpose, she learned how to balance a brush in her hands while on the water. The strapped-in canvas now moved with the boat, which moved with the water, the wind, and the weather outside. She learned to transfer her center of balance to the very tip of the brush, until she could paint a perfectly controlled straight line as if she were using a ruler. There was still the trouble of getting her lines to be perfectly parallel with the edges of the frame, but in the meantime, the slightly askew composition seemed appropriate to the world she lived in. By the time she had mastered painting on the water, she had trouble painting on land. She dropped out of her art class to avoid losing her momentum. She needed to seize this season and not think too much about it. She had trouble sleeping at night, constantly reworking the images in her head and thinking up new possibilities. So she painted at night and slept during the day, with the occasional trip to town to buy food and supplies. The canvases piled up in the aft cabin of her boat, and she had to find creative ways to wedge new paintings into her packed storage unit. She gave away older work in order to fit in the new stuff, and that familiar question arose. What do you do with homeless artwork, especially when you live an already cramped life? Someday she wanted to write an essay called The Artist as Non-Hoarder, if only to be able to teach herself. One rainy night, as she drifted in and out of a dream, a looming sense of dread filled her. The river was in danger. The water was rising, and wouldn't stop. She imagined herself as a caretaker, offering paintings as sacrifices to mend the broken river. Without her work, the river would come apart and flow in all directions, dissipating everywhere and flowing nowhere. As she drifted toward wakefulness, her urgency turned into determination. She could summon more caretakers, work on publicity, contact the organization that planned the time-based art festival in Portland, invite other artists to join her in the effort, educated or not, young or old, the religious, the heavily medicated, the crafters, the arts and crafters, the former artists become former architects or marketing executives or graphic designers become artists again, the recovering employed, who chose to eat food and sleep under sloped roofs and bear children rather than give themselves up to the gravity of the sun and sail toward it until they burst into flame. Everyone. She was more asleep than awake again. She opened her eyes, and the sun shone through a bright, vertical gap between two mostly drawn curtains. She searched for some inkling of what was required of her. Something had been with her and was in danger of moving away, like inspiration does, like the Venetian yeast had, like her husband, like her daughter, like the surges of painting in her life. She had only an image in her mind, and she spent the next 8 hours committing that image to canvas. A picture of many paintings strung together with rope in a long line and drifting down a river toward the horizon. She was painting a distant, flat memory of a deep longing, a shadow of an essential, glorious purpose that at first seemed clear but was slowly becoming lost to her, as it would be lost to anyone who thought twice about it. Lost to anyone unable to sleep without eventually waking. Next time, she thought, she wasn't going to just move on from it. She wasn't going to miss it by thinking twice, or preparing, or planning to share it, or expanding upon it, or observing, or describing, or even guessing. She would seize the evasive thing longed for and never let it go.